Hi, my name's Dave Cooper. I'm a psychotherapist and I'm in Christian ministry. And I've developed this YouTube channel so that people can make spiritual progress and help in their personal development. So if you get something from this video today, particularly if it's your first visit, I want you to consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really does help me get the message out there. Now, we're in a series at the moment which is called Inner Discipling, and this is episode 3. Inner Discipling is an idea that God has downloaded to me, and it's really the backbone of my ministry. And the more I look at the Bible, whether it's Psalm 19, whether it's Ephesians we looked at in the first 2 episodes, or today in Hebrews, I see more and more evidence of what God is talking to us about, and I want to get that message across. So the other thing I would request before we get into this is, if you know someone who's particularly struggling, especially if they're already a Christian, please consider passing this link on to them so that they can benefit. Okay, let's get on with it. Hebrews. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at the book of Hebrews, specifically chapters 5 through 9. And it's been absolutely fascinating for me to find what I found in these chapters, and I hope it will be for you too. Because like I always do, I'm going to be looking at biblical evidence of God's design, His plan, His storytelling, as ways of internalizing these things in order to make spiritual progress. As those of you who follow the podcast will know, it comes largely from Romans 1 verse 20, which helps us to understand that God's creation is something we can learn from. Not just His Word, not just His Son, but actually the way He designs things and the way He actually does things. Those of you who follow the podcast will know that the largest or the biggest example of this is what we call inner discipling. In other words, we take the idea of discipling and we internalize it so that we understand ourselves to have both Christ and the flesh in the disciples in with us. And we have to work with that. We have to deal with that in the same way that Jesus did. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Inner discipling is based upon the idea that we can take God's creation and His methods and replicate them internally. Romans 1 verse 20 reminds us that God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen through His creation. In other words, we can learn not only from His Word and His Son, who is the Word made flesh, but from His design and His creation. Now, the greatest example of this idea of internalizing the God's truth is, of course, discipling. The idea that this was the way that God designed us to make progress. And Jesus fell into that, worked with that, and discipled people. And so we take that model and we internalize it. In our culture, I would say we have been saturated by what I call the medical model. And when we look at the idea of the multifaceted nature of human beings, the medical model says basically that's a mental illness. There's something wrong with you. If you feel that way, whether it's voices or whatever it is, that means there's something badly wrong with you. But if we look back in the Bible, Genesis 2, basically in Genesis, God says, let us make man in our own image. In other words, what God is saying is that I'm plural, I'm multifaceted, and because you're created in my image, so will you be. And the Bible gets very explicit, very, shall we say, black and white around this idea in Romans 7 and 8, those type of chapters, that sort of area. Paul is writing in very simple and black and white terms about the idea that you have more than one facet of yourself. So the idea of internalizing and coming into line with God's truth means that we are getting closer to reality. And better still, is if we can do this, it helps us get away from this idea of the uni-self, the idea that it's all just you and you're a bit crazy. We'll get away from that. If you try to solve your problems, if you try and deal with your issues without understanding this, you will be creating more and more conflict inside. Now, in the book of Hebrews, Paul is writing to the Jewish community, those Jews that are becoming part of the Christian fellowship. And he's really talking about an external model. Of course, he's talking about their tradition and the Old Covenant and so on. And what he's saying, as we look deeper into this idea and say, what if we were to internalize these things? Then what we would effectively have is an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. And really, Paul is talking about the primacy of the New Covenant. He's saying it makes the old one obsolete, and he's saying that it's better in every way. This is Hebrews 8 verse 6 and 8 verse 13 particularly. He's talking about the primacy of the Spirit, or shall we say, the New Covenant. So the first thing we need to notice is that Jesus comes from a different background to all the other priests. So that's the first split. That's the first thing that we realize there's something very different happening. You see, when Moses came down from the mountain, he basically said that all of the priests should come from the line of Aaron. And Jesus doesn't. He comes from Judah. So descendants of Levi were supposed to be the priests. That's what God gave Moses on the mountain. But in chapter 7, verse 14, it tells us that Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. And of course, in 7:13, he was made a priest forever, not just for 1 year. We get this from chapter 7 and verse 24. In other words, you have to go right the way back to the first chapter of Hebrews, actually, to see that this priest in the line of Melchizedek is where Jesus is lined up. And in fact, that's quoted from Jeremiah. And so it fulfills prophecy as well, of course, that the priest in the line of Melchizedek is a priest forever. Now, by calling this covenant new, well, the first thing that he tells us about this is that it makes the old one obsolete. In other words, when we come into this new covenant, the old one doesn't count anymore. And in fact, it says it will soon disappear. And this is chapter 8, verse 13. And as I say, you have to go all the way back to chapter 1 to see that you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So this idea of the new making the old obsolete, I think, is a fascinating one and absolutely connects for me with the idea of being born again. When you're born of the Spirit, then the old man has gone. Now, Paul throws in this really quite poetic sort of metaphor in the middle of all this practical teaching and history lesson and tradition that he's telling them about. He throws in this It sounds a little bit like Isaiah, it's very poetic. And what he says, it's chapter 6, verse 7 and 8. He says, land that drinks in the rain, often falling on it, and that produces a crop useful to those for whom it is farmed, receives the blessing of God. But land that produces thorns and thistles is worthless and is in danger of being cursed. In the end, it will be burned. Now, what he's saying there, at least my interpretation of it, is that that when a crop is produced, it's useful for those for whom it is farmed. In other words, when you get a spiritual blessing, it's only good for those that are in the Spirit. And for me, this is lining up completely with Galatians 5:17 and the idea that the flesh and the Spirit never mix. They're opposed to one another. If you want to achieve something with a fleshly motivation, your outcome will always be fleshly. And if you want to achieve something with a spiritual motivation, your outcome will always be spiritual. You cannot mix the two together. So, in chapter 9, Paul starts by describing the most holy place. What does he say? He says in verse 8, the Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed, as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. In other words, saying that the first would never achieve the quality of the second, and that actually, again, as in Galatians 5:17, they will never mix. So, in other words, what he's saying is that, look, even though they built it to the exact specifications, and you'll see later on how Moses was told very, very clearly, you must get the exact specification, you must get it all right. And I'm sure when they first started, there was a lot of spiritual type motivation, religiosity, wanting to create something very godly. But only one person could go in. It was the high priest for that year could go in, and in fact they used to tie a rope around him so that if anything went kind of wrong in there, they didn't have to go in, they could just kind of pull him out. That's how sort of exclusive it was in this tabernacle, this idea of building a tent that only one person could go in. And of course the blood of animals that was used to make the priests outwardly clean, this had to be repeated over and over again. But when Jesus came to take the position of the high priest, he entered not by animals' blood, not by cows and lambs and so on, but by his own blood. And this is absolutely key, because this meant that the new covenant is eternal, without any need of repetition. And so this takes us so far away from religiosity and ritual and the idea that things had to be repeated every year and so on. And of course, we're talking about forgiveness of sins. We're talking about the idea that when Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished," you get some idea from this what he's talking about. So, what we call the most holy place in terms of the first covenant was actually the best that humans could do. But even when they followed God's plan and built it to his exact specifications, now that's Hebrews 8:5 if you want to check that out, they could not achieve the same level as Jesus because he lives forever and his ministry is superior in every way. That's going on to verse 6. Now, this room, and I want you to think of it as a room, it's a tabernacle, it's like a tent, but I want you to think of it as a room. We can think of it as a human effort to meet with God and to honor him. but it also housed, of course, the most wicked and abusive powers that man is capable of. There were humans in there, and as such, we look to, for instance, the 400 silent years, which you may or may not know about, but between the last Old Testament prophet and John the Baptist and Jesus turning up, there was what's called 400 silent years. In other words, God never spoke to them. Now, if you want to get an idea about how wicked the church became in that 400 years, I mean, just imagine any institution, really, that's left alone for 400 years, and every year there's a new high priest, right? Imagine the level of corruption that had got in by the time Jesus turned up. And we know this because of how he turned over the tables in the temple and how he accused them and how much he talked to the Pharisees as whitewashed tombs, etc. So the idea that although it was an attempt to meet with God and to follow his directions as perfectly and as we could as human beings, it failed completely. Really, this was God letting us know that we can't do it this way, but we need a new covenant. So now we have two rooms to consider. We have two covenants, we have two rooms. The first being the best that man could manage, what we call the Holy of Holies or the Most Holy Place. That is built by men who must continually be replaced and re-sanctified with animal blood. And we have the upper room, which we've talked about several times in these podcasts, which represents the new covenant. In other words, think about these two rooms as the old and the new covenant. Because this second room, what's called the upper room, I don't know if you've ever thought to yourself, why is this room so famous? So many things happened in this room, and we don't even know what house, what building it was in. It's a room. It's an extraordinary thing. But you see, this room was made without any special instructions from God. And anonymous, really, as I say, to the degree that we don't even know, we know more or less where it was, but we don't know what building it was in. But all can enter. Anyone can choose to participate. It's not for just one person to go in. And the room is sanctified through Jesus' own blood. That's Hebrews 9, verse 12. Now, when you think of these two rooms, these two covenants, consider your motivations in your life. Now, we want to bring it back to you and personalize it and your lived experience. I want you to think about these two rooms as being the old and the new covenants, or being the flesh and the spirit. And so it's another example, really, of being so important where your motivation is coming from. Is your motivation coming from the room that follows all the rules and tries to get everything right and all the specifications in the hope that this will make you holy and righteous? Are you hoping that the continual sacrifices that you're making and that are offered by you will make your righteousness eternal? Or are you residing in the upper room? Now, this is not a special setting in terms of God's specification. There's no apparent protection even from the outside. Where all your fears and your worries and your pride and your doubts all come in with you. They're all in that room with you. But look, take heart and be encouraged. This is the room that Jesus entered. Not the first one, the new one, the second one, the upper room. This is the room where belief was established. Even after being with them for 3 years or more, this is where the few that were still struggling really believed. In this room, not available to people under the old covenant, you will ask the Lord to show you his wounds. In this room, you'll receive the Holy Spirit. In this room, you will establish the foundation of the rest of your life, given for him. And in this room, you'll begin your heavenly ministry, written in eternity. So look, I hope you got a lot from that and see it, as I do, as another example of how we can take this incredible story that the Bible tells of everything that happened, and we can internalize it so as to make use of it spiritually. In other words, there's more to it than just a story of what happened. There's a model here. I often quote this, and I love Matthew 7:24, because in my work I use the metaphor of a building all the time. And in Matthew 7:24, Jesus says something just so important. He says, therefore, he says, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man who built his house upon the rock. Now, he goes on to talk about the foolish man building on sand. But listen to that first part. He says, anyone who hears these words of mine and what? And puts them into practice. In other words, we have to take what is said and the story that God tells us in the Bible, and we have to turn it into a method. We have to turn it into practice. How do you start to put it into practice? Well, you start to internalize it. It's one way of doing it. I'm not saying it's the only way. But you can take it and internalize it as a model to follow. I mean, is there any better model than what Jesus did? Can we find anything more accurate, more truthful, better understood than Jesus' own life and ministry? Well, what I'm saying is you can have that within you, so long as you understand that your brain doesn't change just because you change your mind. You know, in other words, your flesh doesn't change just because you have a thought about it. You have to work with your flesh. And this is an amazing thing that, again, we can learn from the Lord, because often we get taught to, be separate and don't have anything to do with sinful things and so on. But, I'm always reminded that God sent his Son for us while we were yet sinners. And I think it's John 15:15 where Jesus says, I no longer call you slaves, because slaves don't know the master's business. They've got nothing to do with it. But I've told you everything that the Father has told me. And so I call you friends. Now, that would be an amazing thing for God to do anyway. But when you go back to Matthew 7, verse 11, and you realize that he's teaching the disciples, and he says, if you then who are evil. He literally calls them evil to their face, and yet he later calls them friends. So what does that tell you? It tells you that those evil parts of you, which is your flesh, that is your disciples, your inner disciples, you can work with them. And just like Jesus, you can create this incredible unity within you. He created a team of disciples that were so unified, so committed. They all died for him. They all died gladly for him because they knew the truth. So imagine producing that same commitment and unity within yourself. If you try to force yourself, demand of yourself that you behave better or whatever your issues are in life, you sort of bully them a bit. Well, all I'm saying is this: if it works, great. If it works for you, that's fine. But it's not what Jesus did. If you look at what he did, he didn't bully them. He loved them. And getting that across, the idea that they were evil, but he loved them, is a very, very powerful idea once you embrace it and once you realize that once your flesh, once your inner disciples, once they realize that you have Christ living within you. The Bible tells you that we don't have the mind of God so as to instruct him, but we have the mind of Christ. He's in there with you. Revelation 3:20 offers you that. And so when you have him living within you, your disciples will recognize his voice, because that's everything recognizes his voice. I wanted to make sure that you were going to receive every last little drop of teaching here from this really rather profound, rather deep look we've had at Hebrews today. In this session, we've been looking at the idea of the first covenant and the second covenant as rooms. And if it's the first time you've been on the channel, you may not have received exactly what we're looking at today, or the idea behind it. So let me give you that and maybe speak to that for a minute. We're really internalizing the external. That's our idea. And what that means is that we're taking God's word, we're taking his design, we're taking these incredible stories from the Bible, and we're reproducing them internally. We're saying, what if we could reproduce that within ourselves? What would that look like? And of course, the greatest example of this is what we call inner discipling, taking the idea of Jesus and the disciples and reproducing that internally. And today in Hebrews, we've discovered this idea of the covenant and the idea of these two rooms. So how does that work? Well, I want you to think of the temple that God gave exact instructions how to build that and how to make it, but it was being made in the flesh, right? And it was never going to be permanent. It was never going to be good enough. And then the second covenant, Jesus comes along and using this incredibly ordinary room, it's a room we don't even know much about, as it were. And all these unbelievable things happen, and they happen once and for all. Because, it's Galatians 5:17 that says that the spirit and the flesh will never mix. You can't mix them. And so the idea that even if you try your absolute best, and they couldn't have built this room any more carefully to God's exact instructions, but it still wasn't good enough. Every year it had to be repeated and redone, and more blood and more sacrifice, because it was never going to be good enough. Now, it's 1 Corinthians 6:19 where we're reminded that your body is now the temple. In other words, this is why we're internalizing all this stuff, is because actually it all happens within you. And it's really this idea that these things can't mix, as in Galatians 5:17, where we can understand what is initially, a troubling idea, which comes from Mark, actually, 9, verse 40, where Jesus is saying, if someone's not with us, if they're not with us, they're against us. If they're not for us, they're against us. And you think, oh, that's a bit, harsh. What happened to the neutral? What happened to Switzerland here? Or what happened to the grey area? Well, there isn't one. There isn't one. And that's the point, you see, is that if you're in the flesh, then you're not in the spirit. In other words, if you have a fleshly motivation, you will always get a fleshly outcome. And if you have a spiritual motivation, you'll always get a spiritual motivation, and you can't mix the two. And this is why it's in Matthew 6, verses 2 to 5, where Jesus talks about this in terms of prayer. He says, if you want to pray, go into your room and close the door. Right? It gives the example of a guy who he says, don't be like this. They stand on the street corner and they give these wordy prayers. And he says, I assure you, he says, they've already had their reward. What he's saying is that their motivation is in the flesh and that their reward is in the flesh. Notice he doesn't say they didn't get a reward. He says they've already had their reward. So what was their reward? Their reward was man's faint praise. Their reward was the recognition in the flesh by others. What he's saying is that if you have a spiritual motivation and you go into your room to pray secretly, God, who sees everything in secret, will reward you. In other words, if you have a spiritual motivation, you will be rewarded spiritually. So, again, take the idea of these two rooms. Just allow this idea to soak in, that you have within you both rooms. You have both the first room, which we call the brain, or you can call it the flesh, if you like, same thing. And you also have the front room, the cenacle, or the upper room, which is the spirit. And as I say in the session, this is where everything's going to happen. This is where unbelievable, incredible things happen, and they can also within you. So again, please leave any comments and any discussion points. I'll be happy to receive them. I would ask you to like the video if you've got anything from it, and to both subscribe and maybe pass it on as a link to anyone who you think might benefit. So until next time, be blessed.